Chapter 29. Inflation. Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its things. Suffice it for the day is its troubles. Matthew 6:25-34. After my meeting with the light, I went back to Earth to observe Denise Richards. She was teaching a class at the University of Miami, and the subject was inflation. She faced a broad audience of students and began her lecture with a question. "What is inflation?" Denise asked. "The increase of prices for everything," a student called out. "That's correct," Denise responded. "And what else?" No one replied. So Denise explained, "From a theoretical point of view, inflation is the loss of equilibrium between the supply and demand of goods and services. This loss of equilibrium, in general, ends up being reflected in a sustained increase in prices. What does this mean?" Again, no one responded. So Denise continued. "It means that this economic situation creates a permanent increase in prices for available goods and services." "Does anyone have any questions?" Denise queried. "Is that the only cause for inflation?" a student inquired. "Most of the time it is, but there are many other reasons. For example, the issuance of paper bills, which replaced coins, is sometimes done without the necessary monetary backup. Without sufficient monetary backup, prices increase," Denise answered. "How many types of inflation are there?" Commodin was bold enough to ask, and I felt very pleased with his attentiveness. "We could say that there are many different types of inflation, such as underlying inflation, suppressed inflation, moderate inflation, hyperinflation, and stagflation. We don't have enough time to talk about all those types of inflation today. Therefore, I would like you to try to understand the basic principles of inflation and the way the government manipulates those inflation numbers," Denise continued. "Are you telling us that the government openly manipulates inflation numbers?" the student inquired. "Not only did I say it, but I will affirm that statement again. Our government and all governments in the world openly manipulate inflation rates," Denise declared. "Why do they do that?" questioned another student. "They do so to manipulate prices. The government utilizes what's known as the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, and they do it because based on those numbers, the government has to make its Social Security payments for its citizens. In this country alone, more than 50 million people currently receive Social Security benefits. And by manipulating those inflationary numbers, the government saves much money at the expense of those retirees. That same index is also utilized for unemployment, Medicare, and Medicaid. As you can see, the more money the government manages to save when making all those payments, the lower the increase in the budget deficit," Denise explained. "Can you explain to us what makes up the Consumer Price Index, CPI?" Commodin asked. "The products and services included in the Consumer Price Index are categorized into 8 different groups or sectors." While Denise continued her dissertation, she began to write on the blackboard. Sectors. 1. Housing sector. The housing sector represents the first group. The value of this component within the Consumer Price Index, CPI, is significant because it represents 42.1% of the total Consumer Price Index. We then divide the 42.1% into several other subcategories. The place of residency, or the place where we live, or shelter, would be the first subcategory, and it represents 32.9% of the total Consumer Price Index. The next subcomponent within this category ensures the proper functioning of our housing so that we can adequately live in them. These expenses include necessities such as electricity, gas, and other items, and they represent 4.7% of the total 42.1% of the housing sector. Finally, there is yet another subcomponent of the housing sector, which is made up of expenses such as furniture, decorations, and other items. These represent 4.5% of the total percentage of the housing sector. Number 2, food and beverage sector. The second group is what we call the Food and Beverage Price Index, and it represents 15.4% of the total Consumer Price Index. Number 3 is the transportation sector. The third group is transportation, and it represents 16.9% of the total Consumer Price Index. It is categorized as follows: private transportation, which represents 15.8% of this subcategory. With this subcategory, we include a 4.8% for the purchases of new vehicles, 3.2% for gasoline, and 1.3% for the repair and maintenance of our cars. The acquisitions of pre-owned cars and trucks represents only 2% of this subcategory. Finally, the next category that we have is public transportation, and it represents 1.1% within this category. Number 4, medical care sector. The fourth group comprises medical care expenses, and it has a 6.1 value within the Consumer Price Index. Number 5, apparel and other items sector. The fifth group is composed of clothing and other accessories, and it represents 4% of the Consumer Price Index. Number 6, entertainment and recreation sector. The sixth group consists of expenses related to entertainment and recreational activities, and it represents 5.9% of the total Consumer Price Index. Number 7, education and communications sector. The seventh group represents 5.9% of the total Consumer Price Index. Number 8, other goods and services sector. The eighth group is made up of other goods and services, and it represents 3.8% of the total Consumer Price Index. Within this sector, the most significant expense would be the consumption of tobacco, which represents 0.8% of the total value of this category. The students were able to see everything that Denise was explaining to them on the blackboard. The information read as follows: Group sector values within the CPI. 1. Housing, 42.1%. A. Shelter, 32.9%. B. Food and utilities, 47%. C. Household furnishings and options, 4.5%. 2. Food and beverage, 15.4%. 3. Transportation, 16.9%. A. Private transportation, 15.81%, which includes new vehicles, 4.8%. Gasoline, 3.2%. Repairs and maintenance, 1.3%. Pre-owned vehicles and trucks, 2%. And B, public transportation, 1.1%. 4. Medical care, 6.1%. 5. Apparel and other items, 4%. 6. Entertainment and recreation, 5.8%. 7. Education and communication, 5.9%. Other goods and services, 3.8%, which includes tobacco at 0.8%. Total, 100%. Everyone, take a look at all those groups, Denise instructed. We are going to analyze every one of them, she continued. The first group, as you can all see, is the group with the highest value on the Consumer Price Index. It's the housing sector. The government does not stop telling us, and in fact insists, that the inflation index within the last 3 years has not been more than 3%. Does anyone here believe that what the government is saying is true? In the last few years, the price of housing has doubled in the United States, and in some cases, it's tripled. How dare they tell us that there has not been inflation in the housing sector? So now I will ask you, who in this country can afford to buy a house or any place to live? Who in this state can afford to do that? Who can afford to do that in any part of the world? The answer is simple. Very few people can. People go into debt for life with mortgages of 30, 40, and even 50 years. People believe, or they have been led to believe, that they are buying something, but that something that they are buying is never really theirs. The owner is always either the bank or the state, stated Denise. What do you mean by the state is the owner? Asked a puzzled student. If you'll recall, in one of our last classes, we talked about property taxes. If you own a house, you will always have to pay the state whatever it is that they want you to pay them. If, on the other hand, you do not buy that house, can you imagine how much money you would save in 30 or 40 years, since you wouldn't have to pay taxes? However, if everyone decided not to buy anything and instead everyone decided to rent, can you imagine the negative impact, whether it's medium or long-term, on the economy? Denise continued. Then why are prices increasing in the housing sector for purchasing a house not reflected in the Consumer Price Index? Comouton wondered. That's an excellent question, Denise responded. Here's the tricky part. One of the greatest deceptions that the government of this country uses is when they calculate the cost of living and then include it in the final Consumer Price Index. The government does not cover the cost of purchasing a house in the Consumer Price Index. Instead, as a substitute, it utilizes the price of renting a home. This information is an outrageous lie because most people choose to buy instead of renting. Today, 68.5% of the families own, or at least believe they own, their houses. Therefore, the Consumer Price Index is nothing more than a joke. It's an evil joke. How much does it cost to buy a home now? Moreover, how much did that same house cost 10 years ago? If the Consumer Price Index given to us were a true reflection of the state of the economy, then 42.1% of the prices would have had to have increased at least 10 to 12% each year to reflect the current situation and the current rates indeed. The government does not take into consideration the financial expenses that these people incur. It does not take those figures into account, and it does not integrate it into the Consumer Price Index house purchases, which is yet another inflationary element within the CPI. Therefore, if you are paying 7% fixed interest rate, that interest rate expense is not being reflected within the Consumer Price Index, just like many other expenses that are also not included. Denise looked at her watch and took a sip of water. I will be brief with the explanation of the other groups and sectors, because we're running out of time. Take a look at the second group, which is food and beverage. The people who come up with the figures for the Consumer Price Index don't go grocery shopping, because if they did, they would not dare to say that the cost of living has only gone up 3% each year. Milk, eggs, bread, and other necessities have duplicated in prices within the last few years. And the politicians want to make us believe that all these items have remained the same and have not gone up in price? The third group belongs to the transportation sector. Gasoline prices have practically tripled in price since we began with all these absurd wars. How is it that they dare lie to us with something that affects our pockets daily? I remember that back in the year 2004, a book called 11, The Secret Code, was published. The writers predicted that the price of gasoline, which at the time was $35 a barrel, would go up as high as $74 a barrel. Later they predicted it would go up as high as $100 a barrel, and that it would continue to increase until it reached $111 a barrel, and eventually $121 a barrel. Today, November 7, 2007, gasoline has reached the price of $98 a barrel, and the prediction of $100, $111, and $121 a barrel is only a short step away. What I mean is that when compared to other price increases, it would only take a small increase to reach the predicted levels. That is to say, a 10, 15, or 20% increase would quickly take us to those predicted price increases. How much money did you and your family members used to spend on gasoline before, and how much money do you and your family spend on gasoline today? Also, even with all this evidence, politicians tell us that there has been no inflation, said Denise. Comotin and many other students were listening to the facts Denise was telling them in amazement. They heard statistics that they'd never heard before. Comotin attentively leaned forward in his chair, and he didn't want to miss anything, as Denise continued. The fourth group is dedicated to medical care. Has anyone ever been in a hospital or purchased medications? 3% inflation rate per year? It's a preposterous joke. The sixth group, sector, is for entertainment and recreation. How much money does one spend to go to the movies? Please. The seventh group sector is one for education and communication expenses. Did all of you know that everyday families set aside a higher percentage of their income due to debt incurred to pay for their children's high school? I'm not even talking about universities. I'm talking about high school. It's embarrassing and absurd, as education in this country is becoming a privilege. Finally, the last group is the group of other goods and services. Within this group, what's interesting is the percentage assigned to tobacco. I am not a smoker, but the brutal taxes on tobacco only end up hurting the disadvantaged social class. Fees in this sector are illogical. In a civilized society, excessive charges are bizarre. One pack of cigarettes costs less than $1 to produce, and in some states they can sell them for up to $10. It's another form of political abuse. It's a demagogic action without scruples. Finally, to finish today's lesson, I will have to tell you that property taxes, sales taxes, federal or local taxes, and insurance expenses are not a part of the Consumer Price Index. Did you all hear that? Is it that insurance costs here in Florida have no inflation costs? If not, then what are we experiencing? How much longer are we, the citizens, going to continue to tolerate all that abuse? Asked Denise. Just as Denise finished saying these words, the bell rang, signaling the end of the class. The students burst out with a standing ovation, for which Denise was humbly thankful. Could this have been an omen? As they say in the world of boxing, did Denise get saved by the bell? People living in many different places heard that bell, and many cities were beginning to have the feeling that something was not working right. In one way or another, some things were going to have to change. To change those things, I was going to have to save Denise from getting killed. However, if Denise did not modify her lectures, she was going to create an uncertain and dangerous destiny for herself. Hadn't Denise's future already been determined? The past, the present, and the future were already happening, and I was privileged to all of it. Could I somehow help prevent Denise's death? Alternatively, was all this nothing more than an already lost battle? Only time would help me understand, but I didn't even know how much time that was going to be.